It's actually not a square, it's a circle, it's a line. But it's a pretty big area. They're doing a lot of construction here. I don't really know what they're doing. But it should be finished in about 30 years. And this is probably a pretty late date for traffic. Again, here's Cairo. We're right here. So transition to governance. What's happening right now? I won't play all of this, but just so you guys have an idea.
For years, their opinions and demands from their government have been ignored. They can contain their anger no more. The burning of the ruling party's headquarters in Cairo is perhaps the most symbolic culmination to days of protests across the country. Tens of thousands of Egyptians in the capital ignored the curfew. They attacked police vehicles and set them on fire. With the police unable to control the crowd, the military was called in. Tanks rolled through the streets as thousands chanted for President Hosni Mubarak to step down. They accuse his government of institutionalized corruption, cronyism, and repeated vote rigging. In November, the ruling NDP won over 90% of seats in parliamentary elections. The eventual outcome of these protests is still difficult to predict, but one thing is certain. Inspired by the downfall of Tunisia's long-serving president, these acts of defiance suggest Egyptians have lost their fear. A population long seen as being politically apathetic, a country which had given up on bringing political change. In anticipation of the rallies, the government completely shut down the internet on Friday morning and jammed phone networks. In Egypt's second city of Alexandria, protest is still difficult to hear. A population long seen as being up on bringing political. In anticipation of the rallies, the government completely shut down the internet on Friday morning and jammed phone networks. The scenes were repeated in Egypt's second city of Alexandria.
Okay, so you get the idea. That kind of thing that had happened right there, that would not have happened if there wasn't this sort of question about the Egyptians' ability to choose their own future, I think. Usually the police have a lot more clout than that. You wouldn't just tear up a policeman's on a random street because you would definitely get beat up with numbers. But I'll talk about that in a second. So as for what's going on with their politics, we have the National Democratic Party, which, if you're taking econ, does not stand for net domestic product. It's the National Democratic Party. And so that's the ruling party that's been in place since Sadat was in power, I believe. And so when Sadat was in power, he instituted, with U.S. support, a number of reforms that enabled Egypt to sort of look like a democracy in Western eyes, and it sort of accomplished its goals, but not quite. So the National Democratic Party, which he created, he was sort of the leader of that party, and until now it has never really lost its kind of support that it's had in the past like 40 or so years. In opposition to that has been the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an international organization founded in Egypt in 1928. And so Muslim Brotherhood mostly stands for sort of an Islamist view of things. But really in Egypt, they've really toned down a lot of some of their inflammatory rhetoric. And right now what they're doing is doing a lot of work to help the poor people in Cairo. And that's actually earning them a lot of support. So it's important to take that into account for sort of assessing what kind of political factions are maybe vying for power. Then there's the Ba'ath Party, which Ayman Noor was the head of. In 2005, he ran for president against Mubarak, and he lost, obviously, with about 10% of the vote, which Egyptians would say that it was pretty much rigged, but they expected that. But what actually happened with him was he was in prison for a while, because I forget what happened, but that was the result of his candidacy. So National Association for Change, which has just earned a lot of news. Because Mohamed al-Baradei, we'll be talking about in a second, is sort of the unofficial leader of that group. They're not a political party per se, but they're more of a mass movement for change in Egypt. I guess here's Hosni Mubarak, who's the National Democratic Party leader and president of Egypt. I guess he's gotten a little bit older since this picture was taken. We also have Gamal Mubarak, who is his son. Gamal doesn't really have any connections to politics aside from his father. He's primarily a business person, and so that's why a lot of Egyptians weren't really sure if he was definitely going to take up the mantle of the presidency when Mubarak either died in office or gave up power to his son or someone else. So he was sort of, for a while, the most likely successor to his father. However, as recent events have shown, Omar Suleiman, who is the former military general and director of intelligence, the U.S., I think, Wall Street Journal, probably, I think they call him one of the world's most powerful spy chiefs. So he's a pretty smart man, but also pretty well entrenched in the government. So he was tapped a couple days ago as the vice president to Hosni Mubarak, which is really significant because Mubarak hasn't been able to find a vice president for 30 years. Except in this case, Suleiman is definitely a smart guy. So, but a lot of, that was, I think Mubarak hoped that that would bring some kind of appeasement of the protesters, but really people, I think, in Egypt are not supportive of this kind of move, because even though it says that Gamal Mubarak is not going to be the next leader of Egypt, it says that there's sort of going to be a continuation of the current regime's policies. So I think they went a pretty clean break from the past. So that brings the question of what kind of alternatives Egypt has. So Mohamed al-Baradei, who was the leader in the National Atomic Energy Agency, and so he helped negotiate with Iran after Hans Blix stepped down. So he was chairman of that commission, and he ended up winning a Nobel Peace Prize. So he's a pretty well-respected guy, and he actually has a lot of support among the Egyptian population, at least among the middle class. I don't know about anyone else. Amr Moussa, we talked about the Arab League and the Arab League building being in Tahrir Square. He is the Secretary General of the Arab League, and so he's also sort of one of the favorites for successor to Mubarak if they do succeed in removing him. Here's another joke. Egyptians love jokes. Mubarak's been in power for so long, and he has a lot of people in his government that are sort of names for these Arabic words. So it says, Eid Mubarak, wa Nazif, wa Sharif, wa Kulu Gamal, wa Kamal. So basically just translates as wishing you a blessed, clean, and honest holiday, everything beautiful, perfect, but all the people in gray are members of Mubarak's government. Nazif, Sharif, his son Gamal, and Kamal. Are you confused? So the gray is members of his government. So there's Mubarak right here. And Nazif, Sharif, Gamal, his son. It makes sense. Egyptian language. So I'll get to the direct causes of the conflict. There's actually a workers' strike at AEC, which I'm not going to say is causing conflict, but it just sort of will show you, I guess, how Egyptians are able to protest in some limited capacities.
Alright, so what's going on here?
It's basically a workers' strike because they get 400 pounds. Some of them have very long shifts, up to 14 hours. This is against labor law, and they're protesting. They want to increase the shifts or increase the pay. And I think increasing the pay is regardless of whether or not they increase the shifts. Basically about how little the pay is.
You guys hear that? They're basically protesting. The workers at AEC, the custodians, were protesting for higher wages, and they actually were able to strike compromise. So I don't know, that might have some kind of influence. Well, I mean, it won't have any influence, but it sort of shows you how compromise is possible in Egypt. So here we have some indirect causes. First of all, actually, one of my friends was, like, I think she knew a few people who were there. Fortunately, they weren't hurt, but she was very shaken by the events. And she, being a Coptic Christian, she was very scared of her safety. So I basically just told her that America is not, like she wanted me to help her, like, by getting human rights groups and everything involved. But I sort of told her that it's really for the Egyptian people to sort of figure this thing out, because extremism has not really been Egypt's tradition. It's mostly been having some kind of there's a lot of community relations going between Christians and the Muslims, and it would really be a shame if that all went to pieces. So now's their chance. I told her now's their chance to sort of band together and demonstrate that, like, they're not going to take this. And fortunately, they did. And this is why you had the crescent and the cross in its Facebook page, which I showed you guys a couple slides ago. That people were willing to not let sectarianism divide them. So the protests right now are going on because of all this unemployment, poverty, government corruption, and last of all, most importantly, Mubarak's 30-year hold on the Egyptian presidency. So there are a lot of things that need work in Egypt, and Egyptian people are pretty frustrated. But for a while, they were pretty, I guess you could say, apathetic, but they also didn't really see any point in protesting because the government was just going to crack down on them, and it wasn't going to end well for them. So rather than make a whole fuss over it, they sort of accepted stability and wait that things were. But now all that's sort of beginning to unravel. So one thing that I think personally directly caused this was this church bombing right here, where you had a lot of sectarian unrest, and that, I think, enabled people to sort of conglomerate around one message, and that might have actually influenced the protests that are going on right now, and one of the causes of it. Because you had people who were Muslims and Christians who were demonstrating outside of churches to keep terrorists from bombing the churches. And while they were doing this, they actually chanted slogans that were like, down with Mubarak, down with Mubarak's government, and stuff like that. And that you hadn't really heard before. It sort of brings up memories of 2009 when the Shah, or sorry, not the Shah, when the Islamic government was facing civil protests for saying government nominated. And finally, the most direct cause was the mass protests in Tunisia, which if you go to the talk on Thursday, they'll be focusing more on, I'm sure. And so President Ben Ali in Tunisia was forced to step down after a similar kind of tenure, 23 years. But I think between Tunisia and the things in Egypt, people really didn't expect these things to spread quite the way they did. In Tunisia, they have very different political structure. They have very different kind of society that's a little bit more well off than Egypt is. And so I don't know if a lot of people had that much hope for any kind of rebellion in Egypt, but I guess they were wrong. So timeline. We have January 25th, which was Police Day in Egypt, and people who were protesting, they called this the Day of Anger, Yom al-Ghadab. And all over Facebook, like when this happened, I was looking at my friends' profiles, and they all had this kind of thing on their Facebook profiles. So as you can see, any of you guys know the flag of Tunisia, it looks a lot like this. And you also have it incorporated into the Egyptian flag. And so this is 25 Yanair, which is January. So they're planning these protests, and no one was really sure quite how much impact it would have. This is another one of my profile pictures. It says, Sunni Muslim, which means we will pray for Egypt. And here's a picture of the protest in Tahrir Square. So if you go back for a couple of slides ago, I showed you Tahrir Square with the big circle that wasn't a square, and Gumma. And so now it's been completely overrun by protesters. So a lot has changed in the past couple of days. And so on January 26th, the protests continued. The riot police started using tear gas, batons, and water cannons to try and stop the protesters from gathering. And this has largely been the response of the Egyptian government to most protests that have gone on in the past, like 10, 20 years. So they used the same approach, but this time, I guess it didn't work. People, like they said in the Al Jazeera report, people are finally, like they're not going to really take this anymore, and they've sort of discarded all this apathy that was present before. Friday. And he arrived in Egypt on the 27th. And that was the same day that Facebook got disrupted and most of Egypt lost communications. There's a pretty funny political cartoon that I saw where Mubarak is unplugging the internet, but at the same time, in his back, the Egyptian people are unplugging him. So on January 28th, Friday is an important day in Egyptian culture and Arab culture in general, Muslim culture. It's the day of prayer where you go to the mosque and you pray. And so this is the day that the internet got shut down. And so 11 people, as they were protesting, they were killed in Suez, which is near the Suez Canal, and 170 people were injured. At the same time, Mubarak dismissed his cabinet, and I think that might have been sort of to appease people, but obviously it didn't work. And at the same time, the military intervened to protect the Egyptian museum, like I said, and police killed 3 protesters, and the protesters, even though there was a curfew that was established, they defied that, and we don't know how long they're going to keep defying the curfew. And so finally, on January 29th, he named his vice president, Omar Suleiman, who's the spy chief. So finally, a lot of you are probably wondering what's next. I made a couple of references to Iran. In 2009, there was the whole Iranian protests that were going on, and people thought that that really could have spelled the end of the Islamic regime and finally brought democracy to Iran and the local people. But that really didn't work. Similar to that, people in Egypt are relying on Facebook and Twitter to organize. The government shut this down fairly quickly, which it didn't do in Iran, I think. But still, people were gathered on the streets and they're doing something. So I think maybe these kind of social networking things, they help the situation, but they're not completely necessary when it gets to a certain point. Something that's really important to note about the differences between Iran and Egypt is that Iran has much more homogeneous Muslim society. So most people are Shia. Even though most people are Sunni Muslim in Egypt, it does have a sizable Coptic Christian minority. And so if the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, which is more Islamist oriented in Egypt, were to take most of the power in Egypt, I feel like the Coptic Christians would definitely have something to say about that. And they're a very important part of the Egyptian society, so they would have to be included as well. So, in my opinion, the protesters mostly need a very coherent message. In the 1979 Iranian Revolution, for example, the protesters had lots of different messages. They had nationalist messages, communist messages, Islamist messages, and the Islamists were able to take power because they had the superior organization and people wanted anyone but the Shah. So that's a little bit different in this situation, where people, even though they don't have really coherent messages yet, they're largely middle class. They're pretty moderate, I think, as far as I know. And something else they need is the support of the military. Military is extremely important in Egypt. It's always been behind the presidents because usually they've meant that if the military supports this guy, then there's going to be stability. So the military has to make sure that any kind of change of regime, if there is one, will allow them to stay in power. But we have to make a difference between the military and the riot police. The riot police are paid for handsomely by the government, whereas the military, everyone in Egypt has to go into the military pretty much. So they don't get paid very much, and they also aren't really too willing to, if their jobs are threatened, it's not really as much of a big deal as it is with the riot police. Whereas if they lost their jobs, they would lose their entire standard of living because they're getting paid so well by the government. So the police are much more corrupt, whereas the military is much more focused on just stability, maintaining stability, and needs, I guess, in the population. And so as protesters get the support of the military, which is not really clear that they'll do right now, but we'll see. Then they would definitely, the balance would, I think, tip in their favor. But again, there's the question of what kind of government after this, and we just don't really know. There are also some regional and international factors that we have to consider. So in the region, I was talking about accords where he signed a peace deal with Israel. And largely the Mubarak regime has been a continuation of that, just continuing pretty much all the kind of policies that Sadat did. But the thing is, a lot of Egyptians are angry that this is very out of touch with their personal beliefs about having peace with Israel, and also the amount of corruption that's there. So there's speculation that possibly the peace treaty could be repealed at some point. And so Israel is very focused on that and what could happen if that ever happened. So that's a very important thing to consider. As far as international factors go, Egypt's very important in not only the Middle East, but to the U.S. as well. The U.S. has pretty much, I guess you could say, propped up the Mubarak regime because it ensures stability, which is always a good thing, and also, ensure peace with Israel. So we've been giving $2 billion in aid every year to the military and government, and we don't really know what's going to happen if some kind of other regime comes to power. So that's something important to keep in mind. And lastly, there could be a domino effect, like happened in Tunisia, but we don't really know how good the other countries are going to, learn from this experience, whether they're going to learn from it at all, or what kind of other factors are at play. So again, the role of the military is very important. I was reading about in Tahrir Square, there were a lot of, when the tanks came in, a lot of the protesters actually cheered the military because I think they know a lot of people in the military, could be friends, could be family. And also, the military is a very respected body in all of Egypt. It doesn't get very political usually. It's just there to keep the peace. But, so they're really cheering on the military, having support for it. And as long as they don't antagonize it, I feel like the military is not going to do too much to act against them. But, and so what the military can do is they could replace Mubarak with a temporary emergency governing council, or it could maybe allow the civilian groups to form a government, if that doesn't work. So those are two different options, but I guess a lot of it's up in the air right now. It's a very timely issue, so keep watching. And so here's a guy standing on top of a tank throwing a soda, and this guy's just looking on, it looks like. So finally, we've had another update where this is just from, I think, 2 or 3 hours ago, where Mubarak declared that he would stay on until the election, which is supposed to be held in September 2011. And people are still, first of all, he dismissed his cabinet, and then he appointed a vice president, and that was all supposed to reassure people that he's not going to, he's making some reforms, but I think it's not really going to be enough. Now he's saying he's going to stay till the September election. That's 7 months from now. I don't know if the protesters are going to be okay with that or not. I think, from what I'm reading, they're probably not going to like that. So it's very interesting what's happening. And so to wrap up, so first of all, there's been a communications revolution, not only the Arab world, but also the Middle East in general, like we've seen in Iran and other countries in the area. So there's Facebook, Twitter, lots of different ways to organize. And so there's a whole new generation of young people in the Middle East who it seems like they want change. And who knows what this kind of change is, but I guess we'll see. But if anything, it'll definitely be an alternative, we'll see, to the authoritarian regimes that have been in place for about the last 30, 40 years. And so this could be big. And again, transition from authoritarianism to democracy as a whole. So, questions? put in place another group. But I think the Egyptian government or the military is doing a very good job of protecting the sites, at least, that don't get damaged, because they recognize how important it is to their economy. I would say it could be as little as a couple months, maybe a couple years. It all depends on what happens to the government, because nobody really knows what's going to happen. Yeah.
So we've been hearing a lot about Cairo and the surrounding Delta area, but not a lot about what's going special further south like Aswan. Do you think there's a reason behind that, or is it just because those aren't as populous?
Yeah, they're definitely not as populous. That's one part of it. Alexandria and Cairo and Suez are the big cities in Egypt. They together hold probably about, I guess, maybe like 70–80% of Egypt's population. But yeah, there were some protests in Aswan. Nobody was killed there, I don't think. There were some protests in Luxor, but it just hasn't been as large scale or, I guess, as media friendly as Cairo is, because people know Cairo as like the central place of the Egyptian government and its people and things like that. So when I talk to people in Luxor, they're always like, "Oh, I want to go to Cairo someday, and like it'd be really cool and stuff like that." So it's a very important place, and if it's happening in Cairo, then it's probably happening to some degree in other places too. Yeah.
Are there any kind of organizational bodies that are kind of just generally coordinating people, or is just everyone just kind of coming together?
It's sort of hard to tell. I don't know if anyone else knows. Feel free to speak up if I say something wrong. I'm not an Egyptian, if you can tell. But I think that they're sort of loosely organized around El Verde, but they're still not really sure exactly who they're going to support. Like most of the protests have been largely middle class and moderates, I think. But that could change. Like the Egyptian government they actually let criminals out of prison and onto the streets. So I think what they're trying to do is sort of sabotage the whole protesting kind of thing and paint these people as criminals. And so that can be dangerous for the kind of change that a lot of Egyptians are wanting right now. So yeah, no one group has really, I guess, stepped forward aside from the NHC led by El Verde, but I don't really know if he's going to actually be the person to power.
What has the U.S. reaction been so far? My impression has been kind of a
Yeah, I think they're trying to follow the kind of Iranian precedent that happened in 2009, where they didn't get involved. Because for people you guys who are studying like politics and stuff, the U.S. has been involved in a lot of, I guess, unsavory things to bump up dictatorships and stuff like that in the past, and get involved to sort of prevent people from getting a democracy in favor of kind of supporting U.S. interests. So I think that the U.S. is really trying to stay out of it, but they're watching it pretty closely. Because I think the last thing that they would want is to sort of be accused of direct involvement in anything. Like they told Mubarak that they support the people's right to free speech and have free elections and stuff like that. But at the same time, I think they're sort of torn between supporting the protesters, which could end with consequences that are not in the U.S. interest, potentially, and supporting Mubarak, who might actually have a tenure to hold on power, which, the U.S. doesn't want us to be supporting the losing side either way. But it does have a lot of important interests in the Middle East and Egypt, definitely in general. Does that answer your question?
I was just going to add, because I think from what I was reading and hearing for the past couple of days, like at first they said the U.S. position was, all right, don't like let them protest. They have the right to free speech, and then it went to give them what they want. So that I think they want.